welcome me, John Paris.
Thank you. Thank you, Alejandra, and thank you to Josh and everybody at the Glen Ellen Public Library and to everybody here, both virtually and in person. So why don't we begin by talking about the central setting of this book, the Mayan people, the Mayan civilization, the Mayan culture. One thing I want to start off with is to emphasize that the Mayan civilization is often presented as relics of the past. And it was one of the most amazing and vibrant civilizations that ever existed in world history. But the Mayan people, as this book beautifully reveals, did not die out in the conquest or in 950 AD. They still survive to this day. They're a very vibrant culture, they're very proud, and a large percentage of the Mayan population of the world lives in the same region that the book is set in the Yucatan Peninsula. Currently there are roughly 8 million people that are Mayan, indigenous, that still celebrate and practice their culture as we speak. A few points to make about the history of the Mayans, again, the setting of this book, is that we talk about religion and mythology and concepts of spirituality. The Mayan people then, and certainly to this day, have this view where they don't really see that sense of separation between the earthly world, the physical world that we occupy, and the spiritual sort of ethereal world. Not to the extent that many other Western religions conceive of those ideas, right? So that's one of the disconnects, that when Christian missionaries came to the Mayan areas, they were preaching religions that had more of that sense of separation. Heaven, hell, earth, separation. After death you go here, during life you're here. The Mayans, it was a lot more interconnected. And that interconnectedness is also something that we see beautifully presented in this novel. It's the central theme of the novel, right? Not only the interconnectedness of the spirit world, the physical world, but even just the physical world in which they occupy. Mayan spirituality and faith has a significant link to animism. And animism is this idea there's a life force in everything. Inanimate objects, rocks, and also, living things like trees and plants and animals. So that's also something we can see. This idea that the spirit world is interconnected and blended everywhere that, Cassiopeia goes. It's also very community-centered. And that's something that dates back, of course, to the civilization, the classic, the pre-classic, and the post-classic Mayan civilizations. Just a few quick points about the ancient Mayans, right? You could see the dates there. For nearly 3,000 years, the high point of the ancient Mayan civilization dominated a large region. And some themes that also I want to emphasize is the idea of diversity. Diversity not just in terms of so many different city-states, but also geography. There's a large mountain range, there's highlands, there's lowlands, there's a coastline, and each physical environment, the Mayan people adapted and still do to the wide variety of physical environments in the lands that they traditionally occupy. Diversity in terms of the relationships between people then and now. To this day, there are literally hundreds of different languages or dialects of common Mayan tongues that are spoken to this day. And the relationship between the various city-states. Some city-states were very large and powerful and dominated large areas of this region, like Tikal is in the center, is one of the most significant. And some of the other smaller city-states had connections. Sometimes they were harmonious trade connections. Sometimes they were client states where the more powerful nation would have, would require tribute to come from the smaller state. Sometimes there was war, sometimes there was peace, there was alliances. So the point is that politically speaking also there's a lot of diversity. So this diversity isn't just something to celebrate because it's beautiful, but it also is something that we again see in the novel, this idea of a sense of uniqueness and distinctness with each person, uniqueness and distinctness with each village and each area that we are exposed to in the novel. So you can see the Mayan culture, politics, history, both past and present, throughout this novel. So that's a little bit of the historical context dating back to the ancient Mayans. And then one last thing, some of the most famous hallmarks of the ancient Mayans is their amazing ability to understand the physical universe around them. Astronomy, their ability to measure time with the accurate calendar that is so famous. Engineering projects, mathematics, right? At a level that was far more advanced than the Spanish and the Europeans that came to quote-unquote discover the Mayan civilization. They had the edge on them on all those levels. Why? Well, there's a lot of discussion, a lot of research to this day, but I think it is really an extension of this interconnectedness that I've been talking about, this idea of trying to understand and maintain some sort of balance with the world within which they live. Balance with the stars, the earth, their lives, the spirit world, the physical world, all interconnected, and understanding that is having some semblance of maybe power over it. So again, you see that in the novel. You even see it right down to the name Cassiopeia. The big change, the conquest. So, not to belabor all the basics, but Christopher Columbus was the first European to make permanent contact between the European world and the American world, and began the process of colonization. And roughly 20 to 30 years after Columbus, we see small but well-armed forces known as conquistadors trying to conquer areas for the traditional 3 Gs, gold, God, and glory. Often much more about the gold than the God and the glory. And most of that in the first 30 years was focused on the Caribbean, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola. But Hernan Cortez was the first conquistador that really made a strong concerted effort to go and try to conquer vast areas of the mainland. And his focal point was the Aztec civilization, which is really headquartered in the Central Valley of Mexico. And he succeeds in a matter of only 2 years with a small, well-armed band of Spaniards in conjunction with many of the native allies that they garnered and they actually betrayed. They said, you help us, you give us some advice, you help translate, you give us guidance, and then you and we together can break free from the yoke of Aztec oppression. And then when that was successful, then the allies were told, okay, now you're subjugated, thanks for your help, but now we're going to put you in the same category as the Aztecs. So there was a very strong sense of betrayal. This, roughly 10 years later, another very prominent conquistador named Francisco Pizarro literally took a page out of the playbook of Cortez as he conquered one of the most powerful civilizations in the world, the Inca, in the center of which is in modern-day Peru, the city of Cusco. So using the same tactics, the Inca and the Aztec, the 2 most powerful civilizations at that time, in the early 16th and the late 15th centuries, were conquered by these small bands of Spaniards. But moving forward after that, the 1520s and 30s, the conquistador expeditions throughout the rest of that century trying to conquer in those directions, using those as poles, as center points, right? So from Mexico City, which was built on the ruins of the ancient Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, moving north into as far north as, the central part of the United States today, and into Central America and into the Mayan lands, including the Yucatan. But something changes as the next 30 years unfold, and various, including Cortez himself, conquistadors will try to go into these areas of the Yucatan, very dense tropical rainforest. The conquest was more prolonged. It was more difficult because of the physical terrain, because of the further distance from their base of operations. It took a good more than 20 years to conquer the bulk of the Mayan areas, and even then, some areas remained unconquered all the way till the end of the 17th century. It took literally 150 years. As they conquered, even though it took a lot longer, everywhere the Spanish asserted their power and colonized, they implemented something called the caste system. The caste system, the word caste basically means a class, but not just a class that you can maybe move up to or be relegated down to. It's something that you are automatically born into with no decision whatsoever. You, just because of who you are, what family you're born into, you are automatically in this caste. And your life is often determined by, what you can do, what you can't do, what laws govern you, and what laws might govern somebody in a different caste. What opportunities you are afforded and what opportunities you are denied are largely based on your caste. And the caste system was very strictly implemented in the aftermath of the conquest that was based on race, based on the degree to which somebody was white European versus those that were 100% indigenous. So in an area like the Yucatan, where there was a lot of indigenous populations and culture preserved, the caste system, they tried to apply that, and there was some success. But because it was such a remote area, as it says here, distance from Mexico City, another factor to mention here is that, again, gold, God, and glory. A lot of the gold was in Cusco. A lot of the gold was in and around the area of Mexico City. They didn't see the treasure trove, literal treasure trove, of gold and silver and other precious metals in the Yucatan. And they realized that this area is best for agriculture. So because the biggest riches were not in the Yucatan, there wasn't as much of an emphasis on implementing the conquest and implementing the caste system, and it also made it more difficult to conquer. The distance, the lack of precious metals, but the caste system was implemented nonetheless. And we see that in the novel, especially when Cassiopeia leaves her village and goes to other regions of Mexico. She is confronted with the realities of her status as an indigenous Mayan in a world that is all these different other castes that she hasn't really encountered that often in her remote, sort of isolated background. Another thing to mention is the preservation of the Mayan culture, which we see very strongly in her home, was more doable because because of these factors, the distance from Mexico City, the relative lack of effort put into the conquest as opposed to Mexico City. So they were able to preserve their culture to a degree because of that. Also, as these conquistadors went and conquered, there would be missionaries. Missionaries came from a wide variety of backgrounds. Some were more in orders like the Jesuits and the Franciscans, and some were priests that were not affiliated with a religious order in the Catholic faith. But one of the things that the missionaries did to convert natives to Christianity was use something from the playbook of medieval times in Europe, right? When Christian missionaries went into places like Germany and France and Britain to spread Christianity, and many people of Irish ancestry probably know one of the most famous stories of the Shamrock and St. Patrick. They went to these Celtic and various pagan societies, and they preyed upon naturally occurring similarities, right? The famous idea of the Shamrock, the three parts of the Shamrock to convey the concept of three parts to one God. Or in celebrations of holidays and festivals, right? The chance that Jesus was born on December 25th is very remote. That date was specifically chosen in the early Middle Ages because it was very close to holidays that existed among pagan societies, dating back to when Rome was mostly pagan, the harvest in a lot of areas in the Mediterranean, and the winter solstice. So there were already a large number of festivals among pagans, so they said, why not add the celebration of birth of Jesus to that? So some of the customs that Christians still use to this day, like cutting down a tree and bringing it into their house and putting up a wreath and things like that, don't really relate to the manger scene and all of the, the specifics of the first nativity. But it's an evidence of these tactics that missionaries used to help convert. It's often not where your society needs to abandon everything you believe and adopt these new values. You can blend, you can incorporate these new ideas into what you already believe. So there was already 1,500 years of this under their belts. The missionaries did the same thing in Latin America, and including in the Yucatan with the Mayans. So many of the Mayan and other indigenous peoples accepted basic ideas of Christianity because they were very effective in blending with their existing beliefs. Again, to this day, many Mayan communities celebrate a form of Roman Catholic worship, but also with very clear evidence of the preservation of Mayan ideas and cultural, ceremonial trappings. Probably the best example would be not in the Mayan, further north in the Central Valley of Mexico, but the Virgin of Guadalupe, one of the most iconic images that if you look at the Virgin of Guadalupe, it is a representation of Mary, the mother of Jesus, but it also evidences strong connections to the Aztec beliefs, Aztec, the colors and the framing and the way that she is dressed, and her olive skin is somebody that looks more like the indigenous people than these Renaissance paintings where it was literally white, like a piece of paper on the face of Mary. So this is just another example of how, to the day that we are studying in the book, when we're learning about the Jazz Age, many of the indigenous societies, including the Mayans, had a very strong sense of Catholic beliefs, but blended with Mayan beliefs, in both cultures intertwining and helping to define the post-conquest Mayan. And then my friend and colleague, Professor Alet, talked last time about the Popol Vuh, the best record of the Mayan mythology and belief system on paper ever recorded, recorded by Father Francisco Jimenez. He produced the bilingual manuscript in the early 18th century. The original of his transcript is in the Newberry Library, just about, short train ride from here, right? We're right by the train tracks. All right. So, independent Mexico. Let's fast forward to the year 1810. 1810 is the year that is accepted to this day as the year of Mexican independence. And the way that Mexican independence took place is a long, complicated story, of course, but the specific moment is El Grito de Dolores, the cry of Dolores. Cry meaning crying out, yelling, not crying like llorar, not like crying like tears. The El Grito de Dolores is the call to arms of a very sort of strident, somewhat radical priest who was seen as an important moral, religious, political leader for indigenous communities in and around the community of Dolores, which is again in the Central Valley of Mexico. Father Miguel Hidalgo, right, the father of Mexican independence. And so this is where, again, I want to kind of mention how indigenous people were trying to survive. They were trying to survive the conquest. They were trying to survive the whole host of diseases that came with the Spaniards. They were trying to survive the horrific oppression and the exploitation, turning them into essentially slaves for many of the years of the post-conquest period. The church is it's hard to explain succinctly. The church was not necessarily the best friend of natives, but not necessarily their worst enemy. And there's a lot of variance between one priest and another priest, between one mission and another mission. But generally speaking, very generally speaking, there was this culture that existed in many indigenous communities that the church was the closest thing they had to a protector, right? Some of the Spanish that were the least likely to oppress and the more likely to protect native people and their culture and their identity, by extension, were some of the missions and some of the priests. And so there was this culture that lasted for a couple of hundred years that allowed some natives to see some of the local priests as a potential leader, and especially a priest like Hidalgo, right? Father Hidalgo was somebody that really did believe in the equality of the indigenous people and whites, which was not common in that time frame. And so when he issues the Grito de Dolores, it was a call to arms for the indigenous people and the people of mixed ancestry called mestizos to stand up and fight against the oppression of hundreds of years, right? Fight for equality, fight for control of their lands, control of their lives. And so they take to battle, and they start to march, and their numbers grow. Unfortunately, about a year later, it's a long story, but his refusal to attack Mexico City proper was maybe a military misstep, and what it did was it allowed those that were chasing him to corner him, capture him, and execute him. But the movement didn't die. It definitely suffered a severe blow, but it did not die. Jose Morelos, who is of mixed ancestry himself, will kind of take the lead, and for the next 4 years, he will continue to fight for the cause of indigenous rights, more so than anything else, but albeit in a smaller, more selective way, and also in a more guerrilla-style warfare. He also was captured and killed, But the movement continues on through the late 18 teens until finally we see 1821. Numerous things were going on in Spain and around the world that made more and more of those white generals and leaders. They were called criollos. The criollos were the white Mexican-born Spanish, as opposed to the peninsulares that were the white Spanish-born Spaniards, right? So on one level, in the caste system, they were united, right? They're united by race. They're white. One's born in Spain, one's born in America. But for various historical reasons, there was a growing sense of identity that emerged among the criollos, those white but American-born. And so increasingly, for various reasons during this war, the leaders of the criollos that were tasked with fighting against Morelos and fighting against Hidalgo and fighting against the rebels start to see maybe it's better if we link up with them and unite with them. And then that way we all together as fellow Mexicans, regardless of our individual status and racial identity, can together fight for a true independent Mexico. So that's what happens with the Plan of Iguala. In February of 1821, the generals from the Creole army will meet with the leaders of the rebel army. They will unite and they will form the Army of the Three Guarantees. The Three Guarantees are commemorated in the Mexican flag to this day. That's why I have it so prominent, right? The three key values that all Mexicans are very proud to identify with regardless of their individual status. Red representing the blood of Mexican people, right? The idea that we all are one blood, even if we are divided by different other factors. The green, independence, right? Mexico for Mexico, not Mexico for Spain, not Mexico for France, not Mexico for somebody. We're going to do what's best for our country, not someone else, right? That idea of independence. And white is the purity of the church. Again, showing that the idea of the Catholic Church did have, by both sides, certain benefits to smooth over some of the violence and emphasize the message of peace. The idea of social stability, looking at people as not just brothers and sisters under the Mexican flag, but also brothers and sisters under God, right? And also, so there was, and again, kind of a link to the history of the church having some positive relations with Native communities, and kind of an homage to Father Hidalgo. So to this day, the Mexican flag is a representation of this idea of unity, and it's a beautiful concept, right? So with that unity, a few months later, they win the final battle. These last Spanish forces, surrender, and Mexico is independent. But beyond that, as a new independent country, even the date of independence is a source of debate for much of the early national period. Because if you say September 16th, 1810 is the date of Mexican independence, you're making a specific case that it began when a priest led almost exclusively indigenous people to fight for their rights as equal human beings with those that had oppressed them for hundreds of years. Very different than if you celebrate September 27th. That's people that celebrated that were those that said, well, no, that was kind of the precursor, but the real independence is when all of us united together. So there's competing schools of thought for many generations over what the actual date of independence is. And that just shows there's a lot of division in early Mexico. Liberal and conservative views, that 18th century liberal and conservative views over the future of the government. The church and state, right? Generally liberals said, well, the church has a place, but it needs to be in balance with the state. It can't be over the power of the state. And there's some that were talking about more secular reforms in line with some of the other democracies like the United States and some of the Europeans, like in France. Meanwhile, conservatives were saying, the church should be maybe supreme over these other things. So there's some debate over the role of the church. Again, we see in the indigenous communities, a lot of these debates, they were seeing kind of from the removed point of view. And we'll talk a little bit more about the role of the priests in the community that Cassiopeia comes from. Another very important thing is the Spanish versus indigenous cultures. Who should take credit, or who should really be the group that takes the leadership of this nation to the future, right? There were many Spanish that said, well, we did it, and the indigenous people followed us. And then many indigenous people will say, Well, we were the ones that that started this whole thing with the El Grito. We are the majority of the population in many areas, especially southern Mexico, where the Mayan populations are living, right? So there's that debate that went on for many years, and even to a certain extent now, who should get the preeminent status over national heritage and culture. Land is very important too. So again, in the book, we see a community that is a little bit of subsistence farming, people growing crops that they eat and consume and survive on, and also increasing trade with henequen, which was used for rope primarily as an export, and sugar also primarily as an export. But the two forms of land ownership are something that many people don't know outside of Mexico, but it's a crucial part of the early national period. The ejido. The ejido is a old traditional land ownership or land use concept that dates back to the ancient Mayan civilization. It was communally owned land that the whole village worked on. All people, all ages, all different segments of of a particular Mayan community would work on the land. They would derive what they needed from the land. They would sell, and then they would share the profits. So it's this idea of communal living. Again, that community bond that was so important in times especially of threats. So the ejido was not just important for owning land and economic survival. The ejido was also something that was an extension of their culture, right? So the language, food, clothing, religion, this unique blend of religions, the uniqueness and distinctness within the Mayan community, and the ejido, all key hallmarks of the Mayan society, versus the hacienda system. The hacienda system is just a broad category to define ways by which predominantly white landowners would buy up or snatch up or get lands that many of the indigenous people lived on and force the indigenous people to work under very exploitative, repressive conditions, various types, but everything from just slavery by a different name to exploitative situations like sharecropping, which isn't that different from slavery either, really doing the bulk of the work for very little pay or almost no pay under the direct supervision, economically, politically, even physically, of the hacienda owner. So there's this competition, right? Many indigenous people wanted to preserve the ejido and their culture and their identity and their autonomy against the increasing tide of a new landowning class that would come after the revolution to try to take these lands and expand the henequen and sugar trade for their own pockets. Also, there's a key division that we see in the 19th century with caciques versus the priests and the government officials. A cacique is just a generic term that refers to a native chieftain, the leader of a community in an indigenous community. And during in the colonial period and also in this period, the cacique was seen as the go-between. The Spanish officials, the royal officials, the local criollos that had the majority of power would have their sort of chieftain that they would appoint. And they would say, you are a chieftain who is responsible for collecting the taxes. And then you would turn over the taxes that your village is responsible over to me, right? You're the go-between. So the cacique was in a very weird position because on the one hand, they were the leader of their community and they had to protect their community, protect their culture and identity and lands from this invasion. So they had to kind of put the curb on that side of it. But also they had to do the bidding of the power brokers, and if they didn't do it effectively enough on either side, they would lose their power, right? If they were seen as too sympathetic to their own people, then the landowner or the power broker could just kick them out and replace them with someone that would do their bidding more, right? And if they were seen as too much, too gleefully collecting taxes and doing things for the white landowners, then their own people would not have faith in them anymore. So they had to walk this very delicate balance beam. But the caciques were losing power after the independence, and more of the government officials and priests would come into the Mayan areas and assert more power. So again, in the book, you see Cassiopeia talking about the priests had more power in the broader community than police or any sort of official. That's sort of they kind of came in and replaced the cacique in many ways as the community leaders, using a certain level of violence to assert their power. And then on the national scene, liberal reformers versus conservative centralizer. There's this debate, there's this battle that actually led to numerous civil wars over liberals. The liberals had this perspective that we want a constitution to enshrine the rights of all the people in this country, regardless of your identity, regardless of your race, regardless of your region. But we also want to reform as we're doing it, modernize. Meanwhile, conservatives in that period were about asserting more federal control over all the different regions and kind of homogenizing Mexico to a certain extent. Neither was really seen as the best friend of indigenous people in the Mayan regions, right? For example, if you live in a village like Cassiopeia comes from, in the Yucatan, a liberal reformer from the federal government might come in and say, you know what? We view you as equal to us. We view you as equal to everybody. You are entitled to the same rights as all people in Mexico. Well, that's a good thing, but we want to improve you, and improve is often done with a sense of paternalism, meaning to improve you, we want to break up the ejido and now change your culture and change your life to make you individual landowners, because that's the way of the future. That's how they're doing it in the United States. That's how they're doing it in a lot of other areas. If you have your own individual plot of land, you're more free, you're more, and then the indigenous people say, no, the way we've had this ejido system has worked very well for us for centuries and centuries, dating back to before any of you guys were here. So they kind of are resistant to a lot of these so-called reforms of liberal reformers. But then the centralizers that are conservative aren't really their friends either. They're like, no, we're going to come in, we want to take your land, we want to turn it over to even more hacienda owners, and we want you to be accountable not to your local leaders, but directly to the capital and to the, the leader, whoever that might be, like Santa Anna. So that's another issue that many indigenous people have to struggle with and trying to navigate, which is the least likely to hurt you in the short term. These are factors that will help to lead to the Yucatan caste war. The Yucatan caste war is a very important historical event, especially centered in the Yucatan. And in a nutshell, it's a lot of different conflicts that all kind of conflate with each other at the same time. You have Mérida, which is the capital of the Yucatan, that's the first city that Cassiopeia travels to, when she leaves her hometown. And you can see, as soon as she arrives, it's a different world than she came from. You see a lot of those prominent criollos, those white landowners and businessmen and traders at the ports, and politicians, right? And so she encounters them in Mérida. And in Mérida, during the 1840s, there was a divide over whether we should be independent of Mexico because Mexico was becoming more authoritative under Santa Anna, or should we stay with them? At the same time, there's this fight over whether or not they should be independent, and they were independent from Mexico for a short time. Then there's also, both sides are trying to get the Mayan population, the bulk of the population, on their side. So Mayans are like, well, which is the lesser of two evils, right? If I fight for independence, maybe I'll be more directly under the control of these, people that we don't really care for in Mérida. But if we fight for the other side, will we be under the yoke of a different oppression? So really, in the end, they split. But at the same time, knowing that their lives, their arms were coveted by others, they also got this sense of empowerment for themselves. Why fight for that side or that side? We should fight for ourselves. So at the same time, there's this fight over independence versus non-independence, led by many whites in Mérida. There's a lot of the indigenous leaders that are standing up. Let's fight for ourselves. Let's fight for our ejido. Let's fight for our culture. Let's fight for our lives. Right? So so some history books, older ones, will you even use the term race war. But it's not just strictly white versus native. It's not strictly independence versus staying part of Mexico. It's all of those things kind of intertwined, and that's one of the reasons it lasts so long. But this is an important moment because this shows that Yucatan, with a strong indigenous population, is still very focused on preserving as much as possible their identity, their culture, their autonomy that they have had since pre-conquest days. French invade Mexico 1861. The most beloved president in Mexican history is Benito Juarez, and he is the first fully indigenous president. And to this day, he is the only fully indigenous president in Mexican history, one of the only fully indigenous leaders in the entire history of all of Latin America, by the way. And that just shows the long-term legacy of the racism that the caste system put into place. But Benito Juarez, in his lifetime, was far more controversial than he was after his death. Because during his lifetime, he was one of the most prominent indigenous leaders that really believed in the liberal agenda of these liberal reformers. So to fellow native people, he was from Oaxaca, he was a Zapotec native, so he wasn't Mayan technically, but he was definitely was seen as, you know, one of ours, right? Kind of becoming the president, the most powerful leader of Mexico. What he does is he does advocate for the equality of indigenous people far more than anybody before him since the beginning, but he also wants to do that idea of modernizing, right? He passes laws that are going to erode the ejido and encourage the idea of individual land ownership. And so there's ambivalence, right? Some indigenous people are like, is he with us or is he against us? Is he helping us or is he a traitor to us? There was a lot of that kind of controversy during his lifetime. But what helps to rescue his reputation are three things. The French invade. He rallies the Mexican people from all identities to stand up for Mexico against these invaders that were just coming in for their own greed and at the behest of a few locals that had ulterior motives. So this idea of being the president that led Mexico to stand up and fight and win its independence from this invasion from France, Napoleon III, that helps to restore his reputation. He also puts on the mantle of nationalism, right? This idea of, you know, unity under the flag, unity under one nation. He really emphasizes that in a way nobody had before. Something else that Juarez does that helps to restore his reputation is, well, of course he wins the war and he remains president. And last but not least, he dies in a very interesting way. There are a lot of similarities made, a lot of comparisons made, I should say, between Juarez and Abraham Lincoln. They were both president at the same time. They both presided over maybe the biggest crisis in their nation's respective histories. They were both, you know, rags to riches to a certain extent stories. Outsiders into the, you know, halls of the presidency. Many other similarities. But one of the most fascinating when it comes to the legacy question is the way they died. We all know Abraham Lincoln died 5 days after General Lee surrendered. By getting shot in Ford's Theater by an assassin, John Wilkes Booth. So he becomes an instant martyr. And all the controversies of Lincoln's life tend to fade away almost immediately after his death, similar to Juarez. Juarez is not assassinated, but in 1872, his advisors come in to see him slumped over his desk, deceased, because he died most likely of a massive heart attack while he was working. So this image of a man literally working to death for his people, that also makes him into an instant martyr. So all the leaders of Mexico, even those that might have opposed him during his lifetime, now try to embrace the legacy of Juarez, including one of the most significant generals in that war that defeated Mexico, Porfirio Diaz. The most famous battle, at least internationally, of the fight against Mexico was on May 5th, Cinco de Mayo, the Battle of Puebla, where a predominantly peasant, outmanned army will defeat the larger, better equipped French army on May the 5th of 1862. Porfirio Diaz is one of the most prominent generals that led the victory that day, so he will never let Mexicans forget that to his dying day. I was the great hero, myself and Juarez and a few other important generals will save Mexico from France, right? Or at least we were part of that. So after Juarez passes away, he will successfully put on the mantle of I am the natural successor to Juarez, more so than anybody else that actually might have been closer to Juarez in real life. So by the time he becomes president in 1876, he actually overthrows someone, Tejada, who was probably a closer ally of Juarez than Porfirio Diaz. But nonetheless, he will overthrow and he will lead Mexico as the president, sort of a dictator president, for 35 years. He constantly ran for re-election. The elections were rigged all the time. And he would have interspersed in there puppet presidents that were just doing his bidding. So for 35 years, he ran Mexico. And what I always like to say is the period of the Porfirio is called the Porfiriato. He ran Mexico much like a machine politician, right, where he would have patronage. People loyal to him would get rewarded with land, with military commissions, you know, the carrot and stick policy. You get the carrot if you're loyal to me. If you don't, you get the stick, right? I will have my secret police come and get you, or I will cut you out of all deals. So, but in the process, he also reaches out to foreigners, and these foreigners will come into Mexico and build the railroads, build a lot of bridges, and he always crowed about that. You know, you might say I'm a dictator, you might say I'm an enemy of democracy, but I'm the one that got railroads. I'm the one that got you connected to this other, you know, port city so you can actually have some money flowing in. So he tried to take credit for the good and ignore any of the bad. But it was his way of ruling that sparked the Mexican Revolution. He wins an election in 1908 that was really the most fraudulent election in history, where they basically said that his opponent, which by most accounts got the majority of the vote, only got something like 100 votes out of the entire country of Mexico. It was some ridiculously low number. He wasn't even trying to be subtle. So this sparks a revolution, and the Mexican Revolution is one of the most iconic eras of Mexican history. Because again, just like we said in the moment of independence, to this day, many in Mexico see something of themselves in the revolution. The redefinition of Mexico itself, right? There were leaders that said we are fighting for unity and the will of the people and democracy. There are those that are caudillos, which is kind of a word that means loosely local warlords, that were kind of petty leaders that wanted to take their local rule national. There was the iconic Pancho Villa in the north and Emiliano Zapata in the south from Morelos. And Zapata, even a little more than Villa, was the one that really tapped into the energies and the spirit and the courage of the indigenous populations in southern Mexico, including the Mayan populations. His famous slogan, Tierra, Justicia y Ley, land, justice, and the law. Tierra is the first, right? The most important land. So he was a strong advocate of letting indigenous people keep their lands, keep their pride, keep their identity. And so many indigenous people will follow and fight Zapata. In the book, you do see references to the armies of Zapata, the Zapatistas, the followers of Zapata. But again, in passing, Cassiopeia is from an even more remote area of the Yucatan than many others. Zapata was a little bit further north than even her area. Morelos is closer to Mexico City than the Yucatan. But nonetheless, he's a very inspiring figure then and now, pictured on the far right. There were those that believed in Constitution as the way of the future. So they were successful in getting the current Constitution of Mexico passed of 1917. And las soldaderas, and they're also known as adelitas, these are the female soldiers, right? Fighting for a wide variety of these other things, but also fighting for themselves, to show that women should have equal participation in governance, in Mexico's future, and even so far as fighting, right? And they were very effective fighters. One last thing to mention before we move on to the next. We're getting a little low on time, but the Constitution is one of the crowning achievements of this period, in spite of the controversy. It was written and ratified in the middle of a very brutal civil war. And it is all-encompassing. It really addressed so many issues that other constitutions, even very good constitutions like the U.S., didn't address, right? So in terms of scope and vision, it really is one of the greatest constitutions ever written. It really did have that sense of inclusiveness. And that's one of the reasons it's still beloved to this day, over 100 years. One of the more controversial parts was some of the extreme sort of liberal attitudes of that day wanted to make a defining, clear break from the role of the church, whether they're supreme or whether they're in conjunction with other entities. There were some extreme secularists that wanted to kind of remove the church from everything. So they were able to get a number of articles, 327 and 130, in the Constitution that were very anti-church, anti-clerical. This will come back to create issues in the 1920s in the Jazz Age. But in the end, and this is where, again, we go back to the book, in all the areas that Cassiopeia travels to, she will see this dynamic. The more things change, the more they stay the same, right? She will see some evidence of change in something very different from the world she came from. The way people were dressed, the way people interacted, the way especially women were treated and dressed. But there's also a lot of evidence of the old, right? The same power brokers, predominantly white landowners still had a lot of power. Some of them literally came from the old Diaz regime that was supposedly out, but now they're back in. So there's a lot of that kind of, a lot of change, but also a lot that's, some change, but a lot that stayed the same. But to someone like Cassiopeia seeing this for the first time, it's all new to her. So revolutionary changes, but also maintenance of old systems. So that's something to look for as you read the book. The last slide, and then we'll do questions in about 5 or 10 minutes. So the Reconstruction period. For about the 20 years after, the Mexican Revolution winds down in about by 1920, the last major battles. And so it's 10 years long, which is 2.5 years longer than the U.S. Civil War. And the death toll was somewhere in the neighborhood, is still a lot of debate, but roughly 1 million is a good figure. And so the U.S. Civil War, 620,000, every death is tragic. But when we want to talk about numbers, the Mexican Revolution was 2.5 times longer and significantly more costly in terms of lives and devastation. So the Reconstruction efforts in Mexico was also going to be more expansive. And a big part of the Reconstruction of the Mexican Revolution were various leaders jockeying for position in the aftermath, but also trying to implement their vision. What does the revolution mean? Kind of interpreting it, defining the legacy of the revolution. Person A might say the legacy of the revolution was the Constitution and this part of the Constitution. Person B might say, no, Zapata, he's the great leader, he's the hero. It should be more indigenismo, right? The indigenousness of the revolution. Some will say, no, it's about women's rights. Some will say it's about labor rights. Some will say, so there's a lot of different interpretations, and that's what makes the Reconstruction somewhat divided and lengthy. Government actions, a lot of physical reconstruction was conducted, a lot of redefining. Art and representation is one of the most enduring. You can see beautiful painting by Frida Kahlo. Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo, husband and wife for a time, both will use art as a beautiful means to define what the revolution was and what Mexico was in a very inclusive way. Diego Rivera's murals are just huge and very colorful that show all people from all different backgrounds, all different skin tones, doing different things as instrumental, equally instrumental in the modern Mexico. I like Frida Kahlo's even better, to be honest, because she comes at it from even more of an inclusive standpoint. The feminine perspective, her own personal perspective. College of DuPage, I'm very proud that we had this wonderful exhibit about 2-3 years ago from the Frida Kahlo exhibit, and I actually learned a lot from it too, just about what she put into her art and what kind of messages, and it just, I can't wait to see it again next time I visit a gallery with Frida's artwork. But this is one I like because it really just shows all the challenges, the linking of the past, the present. But look at the past on that, right? The past with the Mayan ruins and the Mayan ideas and the roots going into the earth. The Mexican flag in her hand is pointed in that direction. And there's a little bit more space here than there is on the other side. So even though she's saying the future is evolving, a lot of smoke, a lot of machinery, a lot of industrialization, cities, and the United States flag, for better or worse, she also says we can't lose sight of our heritage and our background. So this is something that resonates with many indigenous people to this day. It's another reason that Frida herself is so beloved. And it does really implant a key success of Reconstruction, indigenismo, right? This idea of indigenousness, indigenous pride. Sadly, in the aftermath, especially in the 1920s, imperialists, including the U.S. corporations, will come in. A key clause of the Mexican Constitution that was the source of great pride was that the land, the resources of Mexico is Mexico's. It's not anybody else's, right? And if any foreign country or any foreign entity wants to come in and glean the resources of Mexico, it must be only under the direction, under the permission of the Mexican government and the people. But some of the leaders in the 20s and afterwards will open it up more liberally, and to this day, that's a big challenge, right? Free trade agreements and neoliberalism are ideas that are very controversial to this day. Is it a path to the future to be trading openly with so many other countries and have access to so many technologies and resources, or is it a way that we are eroding who we are in our heritage and undermining our own local industry? It's neither one or the other. It's both, and that's one of the reasons so much of a debate. And a lot of it starts here. And then that clause that's sort of anti-clerical in nature will help to spark an aftershock, I like to call it, of the Mexican Revolution, the Cristero War. Long story short, one of the key president that takes power, that wins the election in the 1920s, in the middle of this period that the novelists set in, was Plutarco Calles. Plutarco Calles is the architect of a political party called the PRI. In Spanish, it's Partido Revolucionario Institucional. I hope I didn't mangle that too badly. But it just simply means the Institutional Revolutionary Party. And it's the central party turning Mexico by the 1950s, 60s, and after, for most of the 20th century, to almost a one-party state. There was democracy, but in order to run for office, you really had to toe the line of this one party. And it starts with Calles in the 20s. But one of the things he does as almost a personal, for many reasons, but partly as a personal crusade, no pun intended, was the idea of secularizing Mexico and enforcing very, very vigorously those anti-clerical laws. He passes additional laws that basically ban so many religious practices. So this creates a backlash. And so you have priests and Catholic faithful forming their own militias called Cristeros. And there's actually a 3-year-long civil war between Cristeros, pictured here as an actual photograph, and some of these Cristeros that were killed have become saints in the Catholic Church because they died for their faith. But at the same time, you have the government that's trying to enforce this part of the Constitution that there was a certain amount of support for. They mention it in the book, right? But she says, oh, the priests here have a lot of power. But then she goes outside and she sees the priests don't have as much power, partly because the Cristero Rebellion they're literally under attack. Some priests were actually killed during the war. So it just shows, again, this uniqueness of the Mayan part of the country, where the priests were able to almost escape some of this. If you really think about it, most of the fighting was in the central part of Mexico, near the Central Valley, near Mexico City. There wasn't that much, but it's still very important to this day. There's still that sort of wrestling with identity. To what degree should religion and the Catholic Church have a place in our social life, our cultural life, and even our political life? And it often depends on your family, it depends on where you live, it depends on your background and just your own personal perspective, right? So many of the issues today that kind of cross into both political and moral and religious ideals, the Cristero Rebellion is still kind of there in a way, right? The end was this sort of compromise. So those anti-clerical clauses are still in the Constitution, but there's sort of a salutary neglect, not enforcing them as vigorously as Calles did. And so there are some regions in Mexico that are more strict and tied with local bishops and church ideals. Other areas are a little bit more, for lack of a better word, liberal and a little bit more secular based. And so a lot of that gets started here. I guess I'll wrap up by talking about one of the more important leaders that kind of helps to implement his vision of the revolution has a very strong angle for indigenous people. Lázaro Cárdenas. Lázaro Cárdenas is probably the second most beloved president, second only to Juárez. He's from Michoacán, and he is sometimes called the Mexican FDR, not only because he was the president at the same time as FDR, but he was also a reformer using the federal government. He wins the presidency in 1934. He was originally supposed to be a puppet of Calles, who created this party, and then he basically does things independently, and then he even kicks Calles out of the very party he created. So he basically, and so he makes it his own, and he uses it as an agent of change. And one of the things he is most beloved for in indigenous communities is that he, instead of being a liberal reformer like Juárez that wanted to break up the ejidos for this idea of modernizing, he actually built up the ejidos. He will actually expropriate land from some foreign companies and from the haciendas using some of the language in the Constitution, and will turn it over to make the ejidos larger and stronger. So he is still very beloved in many indigenous communities to this day. He engaged in some level of land distribution and many reforms. He was also a people's president who met with barefooted indigenous people in his presidential home, even during his presidency. And he also helps to mobilize indigenous people, right, with encouraging them to form political committees and even militias to stand up for their defense. So this idea of indigenismo, I'm not going to say that Cardenas was the sole reason that it helped to survive, but he does give it an important boost. So today, the idea of indigenous pride, indigenous survival, indigenous culture and lands are still very strong and alive, especially in the Yucatan, more so than probably anywhere else in Mexico, because of those same traditional things that help to protect the indigenous people dating back to the conquest. But there's also a lot of struggles. And the struggles are some of the same struggles we saw for hundreds of years as well. Threats on their land, threats on their culture, threats on too much connection and invasion from outside forces. But also, a lot of pride is pervading Mexican society as well. So the future has yet to be seen. But this is somewhat of a historical context of the world that we see in the book. A girl, 18 years old, very isolated, very connected to her culture and her community, traveling outside and seeing the outside world, partly with a sense of wonder, partly with a sense of fear, but also very close. And we know how the book ends. I won't go into that. I don't want to be a spoiler if you didn't finish it yet. But by the end, you can totally see that this idea of her Mayan indigenous heritage is an important part of who she is, and that I think is one of the most beautiful parts of the whole story. Just if you look at Cassiopeia. And so hopefully this little presentation on the historical context can give you a little bit more as you're reading different parts. Oh, she makes reference to this, the Cristero, what does that mean? No, hopefully this will help, right? But any questions? I know I went a little bit over my time, but are there any questions that anybody has here in our audience today?
I want to make a quick comment. On the second floor in the high school room of this library, there's a full wall-size original art piece from a Chicago-based land artist who's an authority on Frida, and it's using all the principles that you said. So Rivera's big colors, big images, lots of some. It's a little more subtle with the industrialization.
Yeah.
But say go look upstairs in the high school room. We've had it since 2020.
So anybody there in YouTube land, what he said basically was if you ever come to the Glen Ellen Public Library, you said the second floor, there are some nice replicas. The high school room.
It's an original piece done by an artist who's Chicago-based artist who is a scholar on Frida, who used Frida's and Diego's
styles. So inspired by.
Yeah.
Okay, so come to Glen Ellen Library, check out a book, meet Josh, and enjoy the facilities, but also take a look at those beautiful artworks. I'm going to go up there and look at it now. Any other questions or comments that anybody has? Yes?
Do you think that the Reconstruction period had any similar aspects or ideas as the one in America, or were they completely different?
There are both similarities and differences. That's kind of a broad question. Let me think if I can identify one of each. One similarity between the Reconstruction after the United States Civil War and the Mexican, essentially, Civil War called the Mexican Revolution. Let's see. One would be the redefinition of identity, I think. Right? What is it to be an American? What does America stand for? We are a new country, reunited, that no longer has the institution of slavery, but there are also risks to the true freedom of people that were formerly enslaved. Same thing in the Reconstruction period after the Mexican Revolution. A sense of pride, beautiful paintings, some overtures to indigenismo like Cardenas, but indigenous people still face a lot of threats to their culture, their lands, their identity. So there's that double-edged sword that the most vulnerable parts of the populations of both societies that saw a great promise, that saw something of themselves, both the American Civil War and the Mexican Revolution wouldn't have been what it was if it wasn't for the strong participation of those marginalized groups. African Americans in the Civil War, Abe Lincoln said if it wasn't for African American soldiers in the Civil War, we wouldn't have won when we did. He gives great credit at the end of his life, and it's one of the reasons he was assassinated, because John Wilkes Booth was a rabid racist and didn't like to hear that. Meanwhile, And same thing with the Reconstruction here. We see a lot of the talk and the incorporation of the indigenous people, especially with Zapata, who also was assassinated duplicitously. He was lured into a trap and killed under the pretense of a white flag. So the sense of challenges, betrayal, and many epic challenges ahead, but also hope and inspiration from both Reconstruction periods. I think that's a big similarity. Difference, maybe the scope, the size. I think the idea of the church element, I think, is a big difference, right? With the Cristero Rebellion, that isn't something we see to the same extent in the United States, because the United States Civil War and Reconstruction was done more so in a secular sort of a political framework. Not that religion wasn't involved by any means, but it wasn't like, are we going to have a particular church ideology as a part of that wasn't really part of the discussion in the American Civil War or Reconstruction, but it definitely was as evidenced by the Cristero Rebellion. So those are just two things to answer your question that would evidence a similarity and a difference. There's more if we can think about it. Yes?
Could you explain more of the two sides of the Cristero War based on like family experiences and conversations that we've had in my family?
Oh, yeah.
They've kind of seen Cristeros as kind of brutal rebels. They would go into indigenous towns and take the women, young women, take them for themselves, so. Again,
it's a broad question, but no war is just defined by one. Some Cristeros were truly devout people that just fought for what they believed in, and their faith was under attack, and by extension, their identity. There were also many Cristeros that were overly brutal and zealous. Some of them didn't have some of them were, especially as the war progressed. It starts in 1926, but by 1928 and 29, when both armies are having trouble sustaining their forces, paying them, getting new recruits, the Cristeros, with great controversy, will start to reach out to some of those old revolutionaries that didn't have any real stake in the game, but they'll just be soldiers of fortune. And so I'm not saying it was all of them, but a lot of the Cristeros that did commit these atrocities were from that kind of ilk of new recruits to help just populate their forces. And there's some pretty brutal things. I mean, there was some one of the groups that was the most hurt in the Cristero Rebellion, especially in those latter years, were teachers, because one of the key achievements of Reconstruction was the deployment of a national education system, free public education in all parts of Mexico, taking that out of the hands of the church, really, which was really the dominant educational institution for elites prior to that. So many of these teachers, these civil servants that were dispatched to these remote parts of Mexico, including indigenous areas, they were seen as a part of the big problem. So they were the ones that often got abused, sometimes tortured. There was even a horrible case of a teacher being burned alive, and there was a number of teachers had their ears cut off as a physical sign. So pretty gruesome. So yes, the Cristeros helped to enable that. But the level of blame is obviously dependent on who did it versus who ordered it versus, but that is something, you're right. And I think every family has their own unique experience. And I thank you for sharing in your own family history, you have some linkage with this, right? Yeah. So, and that's what Calles did too. There's a big propaganda war going on at the same time too. Calles is labeling all Cristeros as sadistic and as sort of religious zealots, religious almost wackos that are just ready to kill in the name of God. He labels them all that way, and he's the president. He's able to, he has the machinery of the presidency behind him to help spin that message. Then the Cristeros have the church behind them, and so then they portray this is a war of protecting religion, protecting a holy war for God against the atheist forces that are extremists in the government and a dictator. So propaganda certainly intensifies the anger and the violence. Does that help you a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. That kind of explains maybe there is some bias based on where my family is from. I think they're
perhaps
one side more than the other.
Perhaps. It also probably depends on where your family lived, because no two communities had the same experience, right? It depends on who wins and who does what in what areas. And if you're directly affected, you're going to have a different perspective than someone that is hearing it secondhand, too. So thank you.
That's fascinating. fascinating with the story of Juan Diego. He was
Yeah.
they pushed against the institution of the church. Isn't that fascinating? Lifting up the indigenous, pushing against the institution of the church. And then later on, liberation theology, Catholic liberation with Gustavo Gutierrez, was looking back at this and saying that we need to focus, that God has preference for the poor. And
Yeah.
then also pushing against the state and against, or the state as a federal system and as the church institutionalized within Central America, but also pushing against like Vatican
Yeah.
control. So it's fascinating.
It is very
about
fascinating. The
how this
liberation
is
theology in the
Yeah.
1980s and 70s in particular, and we see that in Central America, Nicaragua, and Guatemala, and a lot of these areas where local parish priests, similar in a way dating back to the colonial period, had much more direct contact and was seen much more of a local leader of many indigenous communities, said, I am with you and I am here to support you and defend you as people, as humans. We'll take, we'll take the religion that is a religion of peace and equality under God, and then that would be their big mission. But then versus the official church leaders that often were by that period, in cahoots with the leaders that often didn't really do the work that God probably would want. And so there's a lot of those fights over liberation theology. And you're right, they do have direct connections to Cristero Rebellion in Mexico and some of the other versions of that occurred in Central American nations too. So thank you for bringing up that. Yeah. Any other comments, questions?
Actually listening to what you were talking about, like perspective and like where you're from too. So our author, Silvia Moreno-Garcia, actually wrote a novella called The Tiger Came from the Mountains, and it's actually this is a different time period. She's doing it on like thinking about Zapata, how he's viewed as like this hero, this liberator, and stuff like that. But at the same time, his men also would steal women, also would be oppressive in different ways. And so she was telling the story of her grandmother who went through this situation and like how like technically these people are supposed to be like of this or certain size, supposed to be living, but then her grandmother ran off to like try to escape with her siblings out to a cave to hide from people coming in, and then it's told from like this point of view of like encountering a tiger, and like the tiger stands in as like that figure like Zapata. So it's like interesting too to think about like how like history remembers somebody and then like how moments remembered, and then thinking about like personal like shifts too. So it's very interesting.
What's the name of that novel or novella?
The Tiger Came to the Mountains.
The Tiger Came to the Mountains.
Yep, also by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, actually.
Yes,
Yeah.
Bringing it back to the book. Thank you. Thank you. Anything else? Well, thank you all watching virtually, and thank you for all of you that came out here tonight. And so, enjoy the book for those of you that haven't read it yet, and for those of you that have, hopefully this has given you a little bit of a historical context and perspective. So thank you all. And thank you, Alejandra. Thank you, Josh. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to the Glen Ellen Library and to all of my friends at COD.